not by grand designs or artistic ambitions, but by necessity, resource availability, and the cultural traditions of the settlers who arrived from the Netherlands and later from England. The earliest structures were modest, built to provide shelter and storage rather than to impress. The Dutch brought with them a tradition of steeply pitched gable roofs, which helped rain and snow slide off quickly, a vital adaptation for the cold and wet New York winters. Houses were typically 1 or 2 stories tall, constructed from timber cut from the dense forests that covered the island. Wooden planks, shingles, and rough-hewn beams were the primary materials. But this choice came with significant risk. Fires were a constant threat in the tightly packed settlement, where open hearths burned throughout the day for cooking and warmth. As the settlement grew through the 1630s and 1640s, brick began to make an appearance in more prominent structures. The Dutch were skilled brickmakers, and clay deposits in the region allowed them to produce local bricks. Though many higher-quality bricks were imported from the Netherlands, brick buildings were more durable, offered better insulation, and crucially, were more resistant to fire. Still, brick construction was initially expensive, so it was mostly reserved for warehouses, official buildings, and the homes of wealthier merchants. The street layout of New Amsterdam was unlike the straight, orderly grids that would later define parts of Manhattan. Instead, the town grew organically along the shoreline and around Fort Amsterdam, the wooden fortification that served as the colony's defensive and administrative center. Streets twisted and curved, following old Native American paths and the natural contours of the land. The architecture mirrored this irregularity, with houses and shops built at odd angles, sometimes with their narrow ends facing the street in the traditional Dutch style. Public buildings in the Dutch colonial era were practical but carried certain European design influences. The town's church, for example, often doubled as a community gathering space, reflecting the close-knit nature of the settlement. The Dutch also built windmills, an unmistakable symbol of their homeland, to grind grain and pump water, adding a touch of familiar landscape to this new world. In 1664, the English seized control of New Amsterdam, renaming it New York in honor of the Duke of York. This political shift brought changes in architectural style and construction practices. English colonial architecture tended toward simpler, more symmetrical designs compared to the picturesque irregularity of Dutch buildings. Timber framing continued to dominate among ordinary homes, but the English brought with them different building proportions, placing greater emphasis on uniform windows, centered doorways, and balanced facades. By the late 1600s, the small port town had begun to flourish as a center of trade. Merchants invested in sturdier, more permanent homes that reflected their growing wealth. Some adopted a hybrid style, combining Dutch stepped gables with English sash windows, a fusion that symbolized the blending of cultures in the young city. Warehouses along the East River grew taller and more solid, constructed with thick brick walls to protect valuable goods like fur, tobacco, and molasses from fire and theft. The landscape of colonial New York was also shaped by defensive architecture. Beyond Fort Amsterdam, stone walls and palisades were erected to guard against potential attacks from rival European powers and from indigenous tribes during times of tension. While few of these fortifications survived beyond the colonial period, their influence on the city's boundaries and street patterns lasted well into the 18th century. One of the defining moments in the city's architectural evolution during the colonial period came in 1776, when the Great Fire of New York destroyed hundreds of buildings. Although this event occurred toward the end of the colonial era, it underscored the vulnerability of wooden construction and pushed the city further toward brick and stone as the preferred materials. It also forced a wave of rebuilding, giving architects and builders an opportunity to incorporate more advanced masonry techniques and fireproofing measures. Throughout the colonial era, architecture in New York was never static. It evolved in response to the colony's changing political rulers, economic fortunes, and the practical needs of its residents. The early Dutch influence remained visible in the gabled rooftops and narrow facades that dotted the southern tip of Manhattan, while the English brought a greater sense of order and uniformity to building design. The mixture of these styles shaped by the constraints of a frontier settlement and the opportunities of a growing trade hub, created the architectural DNA from which the rest of New York's built environment would eventually grow. By the early decades of the 19th century, New York City was no longer a small colonial port, but a rapidly expanding metropolis. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 had transformed the city into the nation's busiest trade hub, drawing thousands of new residents each year from across the United States and from overseas. Immigration surged, with waves of Irish, German, and later Italian newcomers swelling the city's population. The demand for housing exploded, and with it came a new chapter in the city's architectural identity: the age of the brownstone row house. Brownstone, a warm reddish-brown sandstone quarried primarily from the Passaic Formation in New Jersey and Connecticut, became one of the most recognizable materials in New York architecture during this period. Its popularity was due to a combination of factors. It was abundant, relatively easy to carve, and less expensive than other decorative stones like marble or granite. Most importantly, it had a rich, elegant appearance that appealed to the growing middle and upper middle classes, who sought homes that reflected refinement without the ostentation of the city's wealthiest mansions. The brownstone row house was, at its heart, a practical solution to urban living. Built in long, continuous rows with shared sidewalls, these houses maximized available land in the increasingly crowded city. Typically 3 to 5 stories tall, they featured high stoops, staircases that elevated the main entrance above street level. This design was not purely aesthetic. It raised living areas away from the dust and waste of the street while allowing for basement-level service areas. It's often used for kitchens, storage, and servants' quarters. Architecturally, brownstones often reflected the Italianate style that was popular in the mid-19th century, with tall, narrow windows capped by ornate lintels, decorative cornices along the roofline, and carved details framing the doorways. Inside, these homes were arranged with formal parlors on the main floor, dining rooms toward the back, and bedrooms on the upper levels. High ceilings, plaster moldings, marble fireplaces, and decorative woodwork were common, lending a sense of grandeur, even in relatively modest residences. The rise of brownstone neighborhoods transformed large parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn. In Manhattan, districts like the Upper West Side, Harlem, and the area now known as the Greenwich Village Historic District saw extensive brownstone development. Across the East River, Brooklyn's neighborhoods such as Park Slope, Brooklyn Heights, and Fort Greene became famous for their tree-lined streets of uniform brownstone facades. Developers often built entire blocks at once, creating a harmonious streetscape where the repetition of stoops, windows, and cornices gave an ordered elegance to the urban environment. These houses also reflected a shift in the social fabric of the city. In earlier decades, the wealthiest families lived in detached mansions surrounded by gardens, while working-class residents occupied cramped tenements. The brownstone row house represented an in-between status affordable for the professional and merchant classes, yet stylish enough to convey social aspiration. It was here that doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, and small business owners lived, raising families in close-knit communities where neighbors greeted each other from their stoops and children played in the street. The popularity of brownstone construction coincided with technological advances in building. Steam-powered stone-cutting machinery made it easier to shape and transport the heavy sandstone, reducing costs and allowing for more elaborate decorative work. Pattern books, which published ready-made architectural designs, helped spread the style, enabling builders to replicate successful layouts across multiple projects. These efficiencies meant that by the mid-19th century, a brownstone row, the house was both fashionable and attainable for the growing middle class. Despite their enduring charm, brownstones had their critics even in their own time. Some complained that the stone's porous nature made it prone to weathering and deterioration, especially in New York's freeze-thaw climate. Others felt that the uniformity of entire blocks of identical facades created a monotonous effect, lacking the individuality of earlier, more eclectic streetscapes. Still, the demand remained strong for decades, and brownstone construction dominated. Residential development in many parts of the city well into the 1880s. Brownstones also played a role in shaping the culture of New York's neighborhoods. The stoop became an informal social space, where residents could sit outside on warm evenings, converse with neighbors, and watch street life unfold. In an era before air conditioning, these shaded outdoor steps provided a cooler respite from the heat of summer. Over time, the stoop would become an iconic image of New York life, immortalized in photography, literature, and later film and television. By the late 19th century, tastes in architecture began to shift. Wealthier New Yorkers increasingly favored freestanding mansions in newer districts or grand apartment buildings with modern amenities. Meanwhile, the city's working-class population continued to grow, leading to the construction of dense tenement blocks in many areas. Yet the brownstones built during their peak period remained a defining element of the city's residential architecture. Valued for their beauty, practicality, and the sense of continuity they brought to the urban streetscape. By the final decades of the 19th century, New York City was in the midst of a profound transformation. The Civil War had ended, industry was booming, and waves of immigration continued to pour into the city. The expansion of railroads and the growth of manufacturing turned New York into the financial and cultural capital of the United States. This period, often referred to as the Gilded Age, is marked by immense wealth in the hands of industrialists, bankers, and real estate magnates. With prosperity came a hunger for grandeur, and in architecture, this hunger found expression in the Beaux-Arts style. Beaux-Arts, which translates to fine arts in French, originated from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, one of the most influential architecture schools of the 19th century. The style emphasized symmetry, classical proportions, and elaborate ornamentation. Drawing inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman architecture, as well as the Renaissance and Baroque periods, it was a style meant to impress, to convey dignity, stability, and cultural refinement. For a city eager to showcase its rising status on the world stage, Beaux-Arts was the perfect match. The influence of the style in New York began to take shape in the 1890s and reached its height in the early 20th century. Architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, or influenced by its principles, brought a level of artistic detail and monumental scale that the city had not previously seen. Public buildings, cultural institutions, and even private mansions adopted the style, making it a visual language of power and civic pride. One of the most celebrated examples of Beaux-Arts architecture in New York is the New York Public Library's main branch on Fifth Avenue. It's completed in 1911. Designed by the firm Carrere and Hastings, the library features a grand marble facade, sweeping staircases, Corinthian columns, and intricately carved stonework. The building was conceived not merely as a functional space for books, but as a temple of learning, embodying the city's commitment to public education and culture. The symmetrical design and monumental entrance give visitors a sense of awe. Before they even step inside, Grand Central Terminal, completed in 1913, stands as another triumph of the Beaux-Arts movement in New York. Designed by the firm Reed and Stem in collaboration with Warren and Wetmore. The terminal was both a transportation hub and a statement of elegance. Its soaring main concourse, celestial ceiling mural, and harmonious proportions elevated the everyday act of travel into an experience of grandeur. Every detail, from the sculptural clock above the entrance to the decorative ironwork, reflected the Beaux-Arts' commitment to beauty as well as function. The Metropolitan Museum of Art also embraced the style in its 1902 expansion. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt, one of the first American architects trained at the École des Beaux-Arts, Hunt's design gave the museum a stately Fifth Avenue facade with a monumental entrance staircase, flanked by massive columns and adorned with elaborate stone carvings. The Beaux-Arts approach here emphasized the museum's role as a guardian of artistic heritage, tying the institution to the great cultural monuments of Europe. But Beaux-Arts architecture in New York was not limited to public and cultural institutions. Wealthy families commissioned opulent townhouses and mansions in the style, especially along Fifth Avenue's so-called Millionaire's Row. These Residences often featured limestone facades, decorative balustrades, and ornate window surrounds. Inside, they boasted lavish ballrooms, marble staircases, and gilded ceilings, now designed to host the extravagant social gatherings that defined the Gilded Age elite. The city's Beaux-Arts buildings were more than architectural statements. They were symbols of ambition and identity. At a time when European capitals like Paris and London were seen as cultural benchmarks, New York sought to prove it could rival them in beauty and sophistication. The style's emphasis on monumental scale and fine craftsmanship aligned perfectly with the aspirations of a city that was quickly becoming a global powerhouse. Infrastructure projects also embraced Beaux-Arts principles. Bridges, train stations, and civic buildings incorporated classical design elements to give them a sense of permanence and dignity. Even functional structures like the Washington Square Arch, completed in 1895 to commemorate the centennial of George Washington's inauguration, reflected Beaux-Arts' influence with its Roman triumphal arch form and intricate carvings. The arrival of the 20th century saw Beaux-Arts architecture flourish alongside technological advances in construction. Steel framing allowed for larger interior spaces, while electric lighting illuminated facades at night, enhancing their theatrical presence. The City Beautiful movement, which promoted the idea that urban beauty could inspire civic virtue, further encouraged the construction of Beaux-Arts buildings as part of a broader vision for an orderly, harmonious metropolis. While the style eventually gave way to more modernist approaches in the mid-20th century, its mark on New York remained indelible. The monumental public spaces, ornate facades, and grand urban vistas created during this era set a standard for architectural dignity that continues to influence the city's identity. At the dawn of the 20th century, New York City was experiencing an unprecedented surge in growth. The population was climbing into the millions, businesses were multiplying, and land in the central districts was becoming scarce. The only direction left to build was upward, and New York embraced this challenge with an ambition unmatched by any other city in the world. What emerged from this period was not just a new form of architecture, but a new way of imagining the city itself, the age of the skyscraper. The conditions for this architectural revolution had been building for decades. Two key technological advancements made skyscrapers possible: the invention of the safety elevator by Elisha Otis in 1852, and the development of steel frame construction in the late 19th century. Before these innovations, buildings rarely exceeded 6 or 7 stories because climbing stairs was impractical and traditional. Load-bearing masonry walls became prohibitively thick and heavy as height increased. Steel frames solved this by shifting the building's structural weight from the walls to an internal skeleton, allowing walls to be thinner, windows larger, and buildings much taller. New York's first generation of skyscrapers appeared in the 1890s and early 1900s, inspired in part by developments in Chicago, but quickly taking on their own distinctive character. The early tall buildings, such as the 1890 New York World Building and the 1899 Park Row Building, were modest by later standards, but represented a bold leap in scale for their time. The Flatiron Building, completed in 1902, became an icon almost instantly. Its unusual triangular footprint, dictated by the wedge-shaped plot at the intersection of Broadway and Fifth Avenue, combined innovative steel framing with a Renaissance Revival facade that captured the imagination of the public. The competition to build taller and more striking structures intensified in the 1910s and 1920s. New York's rapidly expanding financial district became a testing ground for these engineering and design ambitions. Zoning regulations introduced in 1916, aimed at preventing tall buildings from casting permanent shadows over the streets, led to the distinctive setback-style towers that rose vertically for a number of stories before stepping back in tiers, creating a wedding cake profile. This not only allowed sunlight to reach street level, but also gave skyscrapers a uniquely sculptural quality. The 1920s and 1930s saw the rise of the Art Deco skyscraper, style that celebrated modernity with sleek lines, geometric ornamentation, and the use of new materials like aluminum and stainless steel. The Chrysler Building, completed in 1930, epitomized the era's glamour. Designed by William Van Olen, it featured a series of stainless steel arches that glistened in the sunlight and a crown inspired by the hubcaps and radiator caps of automobiles, a nod to the building's namesake. For a brief period, it held the title of the world's tallest building, only to be surpassed the following year by the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building, completed in 1931, became the ultimate symbol of New York's skyscraper ambitions, rising 1,454 feet to the tip of its spire. It was a feat of engineering completed in just over a year during the depths of the Great Depression. Its clean vertical lines and commanding presence on the skyline made it not only a marvel of its time, but also a lasting emblem of the city's resilience and drive. Skyscraper innovation during this period was not solely about height. It was also about creating spaces that could accommodate the changing needs of commerce, finance, and industry. The interiors of these buildings were designed for efficiency, with banks of high-speed elevators, open office floors, and modern utilities. Advances in heating, ventilation, and electric lighting allowed tenants to work comfortably in spaces far above the ground. Regardless of the weather outside, as the mid-20th century approached, new modernist influences began to shape skyscraper design. The emphasis shifted from ornamentation to simplicity, from decorative facades to pure geometric forms. The international style, characterized by unadorned glass and steel exteriors, made its mark with buildings such as the Lever House 1952 and the Seagram Building 1958, designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. The Seagram Building exemplified the new corporate aesthetic, minimal, precise, and elegant in its restraint. This era of skyscraper innovation also transformed the city's identity. The skyline became a visual shorthand for New York, recognizable around the world. Postcards, films, and newsreels showcased the city's towering structures as proof of American ingenuity and economic power. The skyscraper was not just a building type, it was a symbol of modern urban life, where ambition and technology converged in steel and glass. The evolution of skyscrapers in New York was also deeply connected to the city's infrastructure. Expanding subway lines and commuter rail systems made it feasible for thousands of workers to travel daily to dense clusters of office towers. This symbiotic relationship between transportation and tall building development ensured that skyscrapers would remain concentrated in areas like Midtown and Lower Manhattan, creating distinct commercial hubs within the city. Even as architectural tastes shifted over the decades, the innovations born in this period, from steel framing and elevator systems to zoning-inspired setbacks, continued to influence the way buildings were designed and constructed. By the mid-20th century, New York's architectural landscape had entered a period of both bold innovation and deep reflection. The post-war years brought rapid modernization, with glass and steel towers replacing ornate masonry buildings and entire blocks being cleared for urban renewal projects. Modernist principles, which emphasized functional simplicity and clean geometric forms, guided much of the new construction. Corporate headquarters, government buildings, and residential towers reflected a vision of efficiency and progress, often at the expense of the city's historic fabric. During this time, developers and city planners embraced large-scale projects meant to reshape entire neighborhoods. The construction of Lincoln Center in the 1960s, for example, is part of a broader redevelopment of the Upper West Side, displacing older housing and small businesses to create a monumental cultural complex. In the financial district, modern office towers began to dominate, with their reflective glass facades standing in stark contrast to the intricate stonework of earlier eras. The ambition was to create a sleek, forward-looking metropolis. But this drive toward the new often came at the cost of architectural heritage. One of the most defining moments in New York's preservation movement came in 1963 with the demolition of the original Pennsylvania Station. Designed by McKim, Mead and White and completed in 1910, Penn Station was a Beaux-Arts masterpiece of vaulted ceilings, grand staircases, and monumental colonnades. Its destruction to make way for Madison Square Garden shocked the public and galvanized a wave of activism aimed at saving the city's remaining architectural treasures. This outcry directly led to the creation of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965, giving the city the power to designate and protect buildings of historical and cultural significance. The preservation movement quickly gained momentum. In 1978, a landmark Supreme Court decision upheld New York City's right to prevent the demolition of Grand Central Terminal, which had faced redevelopment threats. Designed by Reed and Stem with Warren and Wetmore in 1913, the terminal's Beaux-Arts elegance had made it a beloved icon, and its survival marked a turning point in public attitudes toward historic architecture. Other buildings, such as the Castile and facades of Soho and the brownstones of Brooklyn Heights, were granted landmark status, ensuring their survival amid ongoing urban transformation. While preservation efforts gained strength, architectural innovation continued to push forward. The late 20th century saw the rise of postmodernism, which rejected the stark minimalism of modernism in favor of a more playful and eclectic approach. Buildings such as Philip Johnson's Lipstick Building, completed in 1986, used bold shapes and historical references to stand out in the skyline. Skyscrapers from this era often incorporated decorative crowns, unusual forms, and contextual design, elements that nodded to their surroundings. The turn of the millennium brought a new challenge that reshaped the city's architectural vision. The September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center. The loss of the Twin Towers was not only a human tragedy, but also a profound alteration to the skyline. In their place rose One World Trade Center, completed in 2014, designed by David Childs of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Standing at 1,776 feet, the tower combined advanced security features with a sleek, modern design that symbolized resilience. Its glass facade reflects the surrounding city, creating a sense of connection between old and new. In the early 21st century, New York entered an era of experimentation with sustainable design and cutting-edge construction techniques. High-performance glass, energy-efficient systems, and green roofs became increasingly common as architects responded to environmental concerns and new building codes. Projects like the Hearst Tower, designed by Norman Foster and completed in 2006, showcased how historic preservation and modern innovation could work together. The building's base retained the original 1928 Art Deco facade, while a striking glass and steel de-agrid tower rose above it, creating a harmonious blend of past and present. Neighborhoods across the city began to experience similar transformations. In the Meatpacking District, the Highline Park, an elevated greenway built on a disused railway line, spurred a wave of contemporary architecture that respected the area's industrial heritage, while introducing bold new forms. Renowned architects such as Zaha Hadid, Jean Nouvel, and Frank Gehry contributed to projects that gave the city's skyline fresh silhouettes without erasing its history. Preservation in this period expanded beyond protecting individual buildings to safeguarding entire streetscapes and cultural landscapes. Historic districts in Greenwich Village, the Lower East Side, and Harlem preserved the texture of 19th and early 20th century streets, while adaptive reuse projects transformed warehouses into loft apartments, schools into community centers, and churches into performance spaces. These efforts acknowledged that preserving history did not mean freezing the city in time, but rather finding ways to integrate it into the evolving urban fabric. At the same time, ultra-tall residential towers began to rise along Billionaires Row and in other parts of Manhattan, fueled by global investment and advances in engineering. Slender, super-tall structures like 432 Park Avenue pushed the limits of height and slenderness ratios, creating a new type of skyline presence. These towers sparked debates about affordability, shadows, and the balance between modern luxury. In the city's traditional scale, architectural vision in contemporary New York is defined by this dual impulse to preserve the richness of its past while embracing the possibilities of its future.